Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, it's a great honor and privilege for me to represent the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at such a significant gathering. In 2007, UN Human Rights Council established a subsidiary body to be provided with a substantive thematic advice in sphere of indigenous peoples' rights. After 8 years of hard research work, the expert mechanism's mandate is aimed to be reviewed and improved by monitoring and evaluation functions in order to achieve more effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At the opening session of the Arctic Circle this year, His Excellency President of Finland mentioned the high-level plenary meeting of the UN General Assembly to be known as World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. After a long negotiation process, UN member states endorsed with consensus an outcome document which reaffirmed member states' obligations to overcome the gap between hopes and aspirations of indigenous peoples and policies offered by states. I'm very delighted to stress the constructive role of Arctic states in the preparation process for the World Conference. However, there are still some concerns about common understanding among states of some fundamental indigenous rights, as for instance, the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is treated as a minimum standard for indigenous peoples' dignity, survival, and development. We need all the time to strengthen measures for ensuring indigenous rights, including the right to development, the right to sustainable development. The international community needs to have an exact criteria how to measure an effectiveness of existing policies. Perhaps it's the time to create, in addition to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an Indigenous Development Index, following example of the Human Development Index. This idea is being discussed within the UN Indigenous mandates. Dear participants, our task as an international mechanism is to conduct specific studies and advice. The expert mechanism recently finalized the study on promotion and protection on the rights of indigenous peoples in disaster risk reduction, prevention and preparedness initiatives. Indigenous peoples are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change. Indigenous peoples in the Arctic region depend on hunting polar bears, seals and caribou, herding reindeer, and fishing and gathering, not only for food to support the local economy, but also as the basis for their cultural and social identity. New weather conditions are challenging food security of indigenous peoples. More specifically, in Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia, rain and mild weather during the winter season often prevents reindeer from accessing moss, which is vital for a food source. This has caused a massive loss of reindeer, which are vital to the culture and subsistence and economy of Sami communities. Reindeer herders must, as a result, feed their herds with fodder, which is inexpensive and not economically viable in the long term. In the other hand, indigenous communities hold time-tested knowledge and practices developed through their connection with their natural surroundings that make them sustainable to climate-related natural hazards and disasters. The expert mechanism study stresses that states should take every opportunity to secure the input of indigenous peoples in the development and implementation of disaster risk reduction initiatives and strategies. Dear participants, in September 2014, the UN Human Rights Council decided to request the expert mechanism to conduct a study on the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples with respect to their cultural heritage, including through their participation in political and public life. One of the focuses for the study will be the impact of UNESCO Convention on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, including how have indigenous peoples benefited or not benefited from the listing of their cultural heritage in the list. More generally, a key goal of the study could be to conduct a critical yet constructive analysis of states and indigenous and international organizations' work in the field of indigenous peoples' rights and cultural heritage. The linkage between cultural heritage and tourism would be also investigated. A special attention would be drawn to indigenous languages as the main channel for transmission of cultural heritage from generation to another. We are very happy to know just some weeks ago that Alaska's governor signed a bill to officially recognize the state's 20 indigenous languages in a symbolic move. This example shows that a lot of support for indigenous peoples could be done on the regional level. On behalf of my colleagues in the expert mechanism, I invite all interested actors, in particular universities and academia, to make an input to our next study on the rights of indigenous peoples to their cultural heritage. Moreover, we are now negotiating with several Arctic universities about holding an annual expert seminar of the expert mechanism in the Arctic that would give an opportunity to draw a special focus on Arctic indigenous peoples and bring up good practices from the region. Dear guests, to conclude, I'd like to stress with a deep satisfaction that indigenous issues in this Arctic Circle Assembly have been discussed even more than a year ago. It makes me confident that the Arctic dialogue will always include indigenous voices. I'd like to thank Mr. President for his great initiative and commitment. Many challenges indigenous peoples facing are common for the whole planet. Access to justice, language survival and cultural assimilation, consequences of climate change, rights to lands, territories and resources. Here in the Arctic, many of those challenges obtain specific, multiplied value due to climatic and geographic conditions. Only cooperation in the spirit of good neighborhood and partnership between governments, indigenous communities, businesses, scientists and other stakeholders can be a key for optimistic scenario of Arctic development. In that regard, the Arctic states, member of the Arctic Council, and other partner states should be champions in sphere of indigenous peoples' rights. Thank you very much.